The auctioneer's hammer fell with a sound like thunder, and Maria Jimenez felt her world collapse into that single devastating blow. The crowd of men pressed closer, their voices rising in a cacophony of bids and jeers. But all she could hear was the blood rushing in her ears. Her wrists burned where the rope bit into her skin, and the wooden platform beneath her bare feet felt as cold as the grave she wished would swallow her whole. "Sold to the gentleman in the back," the auctioneer called out, his voice cutting through the autumn air like a blade. $150 for the widow woman. Marie's eyes searched desperately through the sea of faces, trying to identify her buyer among the leering strangers. Most were townspeople from Cedar Falls, men she recognized from the general store or the saloon, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and something darker. But at the back of the crowd, barely visible in the shadow of the courthouse steps, stood a figure she didn't recognize. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a beard that obscured most of his face. He wore simple clothes, buckskin and wool, and stood apart from the others as if he belonged to a different world entirely. The Mountain Man, that's what they called men like him, the ones who lived beyond the reach of civilization, who came down from the high country only when necessity demanded it. Marie had heard whispers about such men, stories told in hushed voices around kitchen tables and church socials. Wild men who lived by their own rules, who took what they wanted and answered to no one. "Step forward, sir," the auctioneer commanded, and the tall stranger moved through the crowd like water parting around the stone. Men stepped aside without seeming to realize they were doing so, something in his presence commanding respect, or perhaps fear. As he drew closer, Marie could see his eyes, pale blue like winter ice, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach clench. The debt collector, Edward Morgan, rubbed his hands together with satisfaction as he watched the transaction unfold. He had been the one to arrange this sale, claiming it was the only way to settle her late husband's gambling debts. Legal and proper, he had assured the sheriff, producing documents that Marie couldn't read, but that sealed her fate nonetheless. Her husband Jose had been dead 3 months, killed in a mining accident that left her with nothing but bills and the bitter taste of betrayal. "Payment in full, as agreed," the Mountain Man said, his voice low and rough as gravel. He counted out gold coins onto the auctioneer's table, each one catching the weak October sunlight. His movements were deliberate, controlled, and Marie noticed how his hands, though scarred and weathered, were steady as stone. "Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." The crowd began to disperse as the business concluded, but Marie remained frozen on the platform. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Just 6 months ago, she had been a respectable, married woman with a home and a future. Now she stood like livestock before strangers, sold to pay debts she hadn't incurred and didn't understand. "Come down from there," the Mountain Man said, and though his words were quiet, they carried clearly to her ears. There was no cruelty in his tone, but no kindness either. Just a simple command that brooked no argument. Marie's legs trembled as she stepped down from the platform. The rope around her wrist had been loosened, but not removed, a reminder of her new status. She was property now, bought and paid for, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her like a physical thing. The Mountain Man studied her for a long moment, those pale eyes taking in her worn dress, her tangled dark hair, the bruises that still marked her face from Edward Morgan's collection methods. She had been beautiful once, or so Jose had told her in the early days of their marriage. Now she felt like a shadow of herself, hollowed out by grief and fear. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Marie Jimenez." He nodded once, as if filing the information away. "I'm Eric Hughes. You'll be coming with me now." The words sent ice through her veins. Coming with him where? To what kind of life? She had heard stories about what happened to women who disappeared into the mountains, tales that made her skin crawl and her heart race with terror. But what choice did she have? Edward Morgan was already counting his commission. The sheriff was looking the other way, and the good people of Cedar Falls were hurrying home to their dinners and their comfortable lives. Eric Hughes untied the rope from her wrists with surprising gentleness, his fingers careful not to touch her skin more than necessary. The gesture confused her. If he meant to abuse her, why show such restraint? If he meant to be kind, why had he bought her at all? I have supplies to gather, he said, coiling the rope and tucking it into his belt. Stay close. They walked through the town in silence, Marie's bare feet finding purchase on the cold dirt streets. People stared as they passed, some with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with the sort of knowing looks that made her want to disappear. She had lived in Cedar Falls for 2 years, had thought she was building a life here, but now she felt like a stranger in a hostile land. At the general store, Eric Hughes moved through his shopping with methodical efficiency. Salt, flour, coffee, ammunition, blankets, and other supplies that spoke of a long journey ahead. The storekeeper, Kenneth Miller, kept glancing at Marie with obvious discomfort. "That'll be $37 even," Kenneth said, his voice tight with disapproval. "You sure about this, Hughes? Taking on another man's troubles?" Eric's eyes went cold as winter. "My business is my own, Miller. Just wrap the supplies." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and Marie found herself holding her breath. There was something dangerous about Eric Hughes, she realized. Something that made even the townspeople wary. But it wasn't the crude brutality she had expected. It was something more refined, more controlled. Like a wolf that had learned to walk among sheep but never forgotten what it was. As they left the store, Marie caught sight of her reflection in the window glass. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, hollow-eyed and broken, her dark hair hanging in limp strands around a face marked by recent violence. This was what she had become. This was what was left of Marie Jimenez. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Eric Hughes led her to where his horse was tethered behind the livery stable. It was a massive black gelding, 17 hands if it was an inch, with intelligent eyes and the sort of calm temperament that spoke of careful training. The animal regarded Marie with mild curiosity, showing none of the skittishness that horses often displayed around strangers. "Can you ride?" Eric asked, checking the saddle cinch with practiced hands. Marie shook her head. Jose had never seen fit to teach her, claiming that riding was a man's skill and that she had no need of it. Now she wished desperately that she had insisted on learning, if only to maintain some small measure of independence in whatever was coming. Eric nodded as if he had expected as much. "You'll ride behind me then. It's a long way to where we're going." "Where?" she managed to ask, the first full word she had spoken since telling him her name. He paused in his preparations and looked at her directly. "Home," he said simply, as if that explained everything. But whose home? His home, obviously, but what did that mean for her? Was she to be a servant, a slave, something worse? The questions burned in her throat, but she couldn't find the courage to voice them. Fear had stolen her words, leaving her mute as a stone. Eric mounted the gelding with fluid grace, then extended his hand down to her. "Take my hand, put your foot on my boot, and swing up behind me." Marie stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment. This was the moment of no return, she realized. Once she climbed onto that horse, she would be leaving everything she had ever known, riding into an uncertain future with a man who was little more than a stranger. But what was the alternative? Edward Morgan had made it clear that refusing to go with her buyer would result in consequences far worse than whatever awaited her in the mountains. She took his hand. His grip was strong and sure, and he lifted her up behind him as if she weighed nothing at all. The horse shifted slightly under the additional weight but showed no other reaction. Marie found herself pressed against Eric's broad back, her arms instinctively wrapping around his waist to keep from falling. Through his wool shirt, she could feel the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the controlled power in his frame. "Hold tight," he said, and urged the horse forward. They rode out of Cedar Falls as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Marie watched the familiar buildings fall away behind them, each one a connection to her old life being severed. The church where she had been married, the boarding house where she had lived as a new bride, the cemetery where Jose lay buried under a simple wooden cross, all of it disappearing into the gathering darkness like a dream upon waking. The road they followed was little more than a track, winding up into the foothills through stands of pine and aspen. The air grew colder as they climbed, and Marie was grateful for Eric's warmth at her back. She had no coat, no proper shoes, Nothing but the thin dress she wore and the shawl that Edward Morgan had allowed her to keep. It would not be enough for a mountain winter, she knew, and the thought sent fresh fear coursing through her. They rode in silence for what felt like hours, the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves the only sound besides the whisper of wind through the trees. Marie's legs began to ache from gripping the horse's sides, and her arms grew numb from holding on to Eric's waist, but she didn't dare complain. She was alive. She was away from Cedar Falls and Edward Morgan's cruel hands, and for now that had to be enough. The moon was high and full when Eric finally brought the horse to a halt beside a small stream. The water chuckled over stones, a peaceful sound that seemed at odds with the turmoil in Marie's heart. Eric dismounted first, then helped her down with the same careful courtesy he had shown before. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said, beginning to unsaddle the horse. "Let midnight drink and graze. It's still a long way to the cabin." Marie stood uncertainly beside the stream, watching as he worked. His movements were efficient and practiced, speaking of countless nights spent camping under the open sky. This was his world, she realized, this wilderness that seemed so alien and threatening to her. He belonged here in a way that she had never belonged anywhere, not even in the town she had called home. "There's jerky in the saddlebags," he said, without looking at her, "and a canteen of water. You should eat something." She was hungry, she realized with surprise. She hadn't eaten since the morning, too sick with fear to take the meager breakfast that the sheriff's wife had offered. Now her stomach cramped with emptiness, reminding her that her body had needs regardless of her circumstances. The jerky was tough and salty, but it was food, and she ate it gratefully while Eric tended to his horse. He spoke to the animal in low, gentle tones, checking its hooves and rubbing down its coat with practiced hands. There was affection in his touch, she noticed, a tenderness that he had not shown toward her. But then she reminded herself bitterly, the horse was his companion. She was just property. "Why so?" she asked suddenly, the word escaping before she could stop it. Eric looked up from where he was hobbling the horse. "Why what? Why did you buy me?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. "Why outbid the others?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then he straightened and looked at her directly, those pale eyes unreadable in the moonlight. "Because I could afford to," he said finally. "And because you deserve better than what the others had in mind." The answer raised more questions than it answered, but something in his tone warned her not to press further. Instead, she wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and tried to find a comfortable position on the hard ground. The stars overhead were brighter than she had ever seen them in town, a vast canopy of light that made her feel small and lost. Eric settled down across the small clearing from her, his back against a fallen log, his rifle within easy reach. Even in rest, he remained alert, his head turning at every sound from the forest around them. A protector's instinct or a predator's wariness? Marie couldn't tell which. "Sleep if you can," he said quietly. "We ride again before dawn." But sleep seemed impossible. Every time Marie closed her eyes, she saw Edward Morgan's leering face, heard the auctioneer's hammer falling, felt the rope burning her wrists. Her old life was gone, destroyed as completely as if it had never existed. And her new life? That remained a mystery wrapped in the enigma of the man who had bought her. She must have dozed despite herself, because she woke to find Eric gently shaking her shoulder. The sky was still dark, but there was a hint of gray on the eastern horizon that spoke of approaching dawn. "Time to go," he said softly. The second day of their journey took them higher into the mountains, along paths that seemed to exist more in Eric's memory than in any physical reality. The horse picked its way carefully over loose rocks and fallen trees, sure-footed as a mountain goat despite the treacherous terrain. Marie clung to Eric's waist and tried not to look down at the dizzying drops that opened up beside the narrow trail. The landscape around them was breathtaking in its wild beauty. Towering peaks thrust up into a sky so blue it hurt to look at, their summits crowned with snow that gleamed like diamonds in the morning sun. Vast forests of pine and fir clothed the lower slopes, broken here and there by meadows, where the last wild flowers of the season painted splashes of color against the green. It was beautiful, but it was also utterly alien to someone who had spent her life in towns and settlements. "How much farther?" Marie asked as they paused to rest beside another stream. We'll reach the valley before dark, Eric replied, letting Midnight drink his fill. The cabin's there, built into the side of the mountain where it's protected from the worst of the winter winds. A cabin. The word conjured images of rough logs and primitive conditions, of isolation so complete that the outside world might as well not exist. Marie had grown up in a soddy on the Kansas prairie, had known hardship and want, but she had never lived truly alone. There had always been neighbors within walking distance, a town within a day's ride. Here there would be nothing but wilderness and the man who had bought her. Do you live alone? She asked, then immediately regretted the question. Of course he lived alone. If he had a wife, he wouldn't have needed to buy one at auction. I did, Eric said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was pain there, old and carefully buried, but real nonetheless. My wife died 3 years ago. Fever took her in the space of a week. The revelation hit Marie like a physical blow. She had assumed that Eric Hughes was simply a lonely bachelor who had decided to acquire a woman the way he might acquire livestock. But he was a widower, like her. He had loved and lost, had known the particular agony of watching someone slip away beyond all help or hope. I'm sorry, she said and meant it. He nodded once, accepting her condolence with the same stoic grace he seemed to bring to everything. Her name was Nancy Smith before we married. She was from back east, came out here with her family when she was 16. We met at a church social in Denver, married 6 months later. Marie tried to imagine this hard, silent man at a church social, courting a young woman with all the awkward sweetness of new love. It seemed impossible, but then again, grief changed people. She knew that better than most. She loved the mountains, Eric continued, his voice growing softer. Said they made her feel closer to God. We built the cabin together, planned to raise a family there, but it wasn't to be. The pain in his words was carefully controlled but unmistakable. Marie found herself wondering what Nancy Smith had been like, this woman who had captured the heart of a mountain man. Beautiful, probably. Gentle. Everything that Marie was not, everything that she could never be again. They rode on in silence after that, climbing ever higher into a world of stone and sky. The air grew thinner, making Marie's lungs work harder with each breath. Her body ached from the unaccustomed riding, and her hands were numb with cold despite Eric's warmth at her back. But she didn't complain. Complaint would serve no purpose, and she sensed that Eric Hughes was not a man who would tolerate weakness. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they crested a ridge and Marie caught her first glimpse of the valley that would be her new home. It was smaller than she had expected, perhaps a mile across and twice that in length, surrounded by towering cliffs that rose like the walls of a cathedral. A stream wound through the center of the valley, its waters catching the light like scattered silver. And there, tucked into a grove of aspen trees near the base of the northern cliff, stood a log cabin. Even from a distance, Marie could see that it was well-built and substantial. Not the rough shack she had been imagining. Smoke rose from its stone chimney, and there were outbuildings nearby, a barn and what looked like a root cellar. It was isolated, certainly, but it was also clearly a home where someone had invested time and care. It's beautiful, she said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. Eric guided Midnight down the steep trail that led into the valley, the horse's hooves sending small stones clattering into the depths below. As they drew closer to the cabin, Marie could make out more details. The logs were chinked with mud and moss, the roof was shake shingle, and there was a wide porch across the front that looked out over the valley. Wildflowers grew in profusion around the foundation, and she could see a vegetable garden behind the house where the last tomatoes hung heavy on their vines. It looked like a place where people could be happy, she thought with a pang of unexpected longing. A place where a man and woman might build a life together, raise children, grow old in peace, but Nancy Smith was dead, and Marie Jimenez was here not as a wife, but as property bought and paid for. They reached the cabin just as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Eric dismounted and helped Marie down, her legs nearly buckling as her feet touched solid ground. She had been riding for the better part of 2 days, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Go inside, Eric said, beginning to unsaddle Midnight. There's firewood by the hearth and food in the larder. I'll be in once I've seen to the horse." Marie approached the cabin door with something approaching reverence. This was the threshold of her new life, whatever that might prove to be. The door was solid oak, fitted with iron hinges that spoke of craftsmanship and care. She lifted the latch and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside. One large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor, with a sleeping loft above reached by a ladder. The furniture was simple but well made, clearly crafted by someone who understood both wood and the needs of mountain living. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and dark. Windows on either side let in the last of the evening light, but it was the small details that caught Marie's attention. Curtains at the windows, made from calico fabric in a pattern of tiny blue flowers. A braided rug on the floor before the fireplace. Books on a shelf beside the hearth, their leather bindings worn smooth by countless readings. These were a woman's touches, Nancy Smith's touches, preserved like relics in a shrine. Marie moved through the space like a ghost, afraid to disturb anything, afraid to leave evidence of her presence. This had been Nancy's home, Nancy's domain. What right did she have to be here? What right did she have to stand where another woman had cooked and cleaned and dreamed of the future? The sound of Eric's boots on the porch steps sent her scurrying to the fireplace, where she began laying kindling with hands that shook from more than cold. By the time he entered the cabin, she had a small fire crackling and was adding larger pieces of wood to build it up. "Good," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "It gets cold up here once the sun goes down." He moved through the cabin with the easy familiarity of long habit, lighting oil lamps, checking the water bucket, opening the larder to see what supplies remained. Marie watched him covertly, trying to understand this man who had bought her but seemed to want nothing from her. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, she realized with surprise. The beard hid much of his face, but his features were strong and well-proportioned. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 35, with the lean build of a man who lived by physical labor. "There's salt pork and beans," he said, pulling supplies from the larder. "Cornbread from yesterday. It'll do for tonight." He began preparing the meal with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. Marie stood uncertainly by the fire, unsure what was expected of her. Was she supposed to help, to sit quietly and wait, to offer herself to him in payment for food and shelter? The uncertainty was almost worse than fear. "Sit," Eric said without looking at her. "You've had a hard 2 days." Marie sank onto a wooden chair near the table, grateful beyond words for the simple kindness of the gesture. Eric worked in silence, slicing salt pork into a heavy skillet, adding beans and water, setting the mixture to simmer over the fire. The familiar domestic sounds filled the cabin, creating an illusion of normalcy that made Marie's throat tight with unexpected emotion. When the food was ready, Eric served it onto 2 plates and set one before her. The meal was simple but hot and filling, and Marie ate with an appetite she hadn't felt in months. Across the table, Eric ate in silence, his pale eyes occasionally flicking to her face but otherwise focused on his food. "Thank you," Marie said when she had finished. Eric nodded once. "There's a room upstairs," he said. "Nancy's sewing room. You can sleep there. I'll bring up some blankets." A room of her own. Privacy, safety. Marie felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them away quickly. She would not cry, not here, not in front of him. She had cried enough tears over the past months to last a lifetime. Eric climbed the ladder to the loft and returned with an armload of quilts and blankets. "The room's at the back," he said. "There's a window that looks out over the valley." Nancy used to sit there in the mornings watching the sun come up over the eastern peaks. Again, that carefully controlled pain in his voice when he spoke of his dead wife. Marie followed him up the ladder on unsteady legs, her body protesting every movement. The loft was divided into 2 rooms. The larger, clearly Eric's bedroom. The smaller fitted out as a sewing room with a chair by the window and shelves lined with fabric and thread. Eric made up a bed for her on the narrow cot in the corner, his movements brisk and impersonal. When he was finished, he stepped back and looked at her directly for the first time since they had entered the cabin. "I want you to understand something," he said, his voice low and serious. "I didn't buy you to be my whore. I didn't buy you to replace Nancy. I bought you because Edward Morgan would have sold you to men who would have used you until there was nothing left, then thrown you away like garbage. Marie stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You'll work for your keep, Eric continued. Cook, clean, help with the chores, but you'll be safe here. No man will touch you without your permission. Not even me. The words hit her like a physical blow, so unexpected and so desperately hoped for that she couldn't speak. Safety. The one thing she had thought lost forever, offered to her by a stranger who had every right to demand whatever he wanted from her. What's that? She whispered. Eric was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Because Nancy would have wanted it that way, he said finally. Because some things are right and some things are wrong, and a man has to live with himself. He turned toward the ladder, then paused. There's a bar for the door, he said without looking back. Use it if it makes you feel safer. Then he was gone, leaving Marie alone in Nancy Smith's sewing room with her thoughts and her fears and the first faint stirring of something that might someday become hope. But as Marie settled into the narrow cot and pulled Nancy's quilts up to her chin, she heard voices outside the cabin, low, urgent voices that didn't belong to Eric Hughes. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized one of them. Edward Morgan had followed them into the mountains. Marie's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the cold log wall, straining to hear the voices outside. The quilts that had promised comfort moments before now felt like a shroud, trapping her in this small room while danger gathered in the darkness below. Through the thin chinking between the logs, she could see the faint glow of lantern light moving around the cabin's perimeter. I know you're in there, Hughes, Edward Morgan's voice carried clearly through the mountain air, thick with satisfaction and something darker. Saw the smoke from your chimney clear down in the valley. You have got something that belongs to me. Marie heard Eric's boots on the cabin floor below, the careful sound of a man moving with purpose, a rifle being lifted from its pegs, the soft snick of a cartridge being chambered. When Eric spoke, his voice was steady as stone, but she could hear the deadly promise beneath the calm words. Nothing here belongs to you, Morgan. You got your money. Transaction's done. Transaction? Morgan's laugh was like broken glass. That woman's got debts beyond what you paid. Seems her dear departed husband owed money to more folks than just me. I'm here to collect what's rightfully owed. Through the small window, Marie could make out shapes moving in the darkness. How many men had Morgan brought with him? 3, 4. Her mouth went dry as she realized the true scope of her situation. Even if Eric had been willing to protect her, what could one man do against multiple armed adversaries? Show me the papers, Eric said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had dealt with Morgan's kind before. Legal documents with proper signatures and witnesses. Otherwise, you're trespassing on my land, and mountain law applies up here. Mountain law. Marie had heard whispers of such things in town, stories of rough justice dispensed far from the reach of sheriffs and courts. Men who lived beyond civilization's boundaries made their own rules, settled their own disputes. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange flutter of hope. Eric Hughes belonged to this harsh world in a way that Edward Morgan, for all his bluster and cruelty, never could. Don't need papers for what everyone knows, Morgan called back. Jose Roberts died owing money all over Cedar Falls. His widow's responsible for settling those debts, one way or another. I've got men here who'll swear to it. The sound of movement below told Marie that Eric was positioning himself, probably near a window where he could see the men outside while remaining protected. She had watched him move through the cabin earlier, noting how he unconsciously cataloged sightlines and defensive positions. This was not a man who would be easily surprised or overwhelmed. Jose Roberts is dead, Eric replied, his voice carrying clearly through the still mountain air. His debts died with him. The woman's free and clear. Not how it works, mountain man. A wife's responsible for her husband's obligations. Always has been, always will be. Now send her out, and we can settle this peaceful-like. Marie closed her eyes, knowing with sick certainty what Morgan meant by settling things peacefully. She had seen the way his men looked at her during the auction, had heard their crude comments and suggestions. They had come all this way not for money but for her. The debt was just an excuse, a thin legal fiction to justify what they really wanted. She stays, Eric said simply. The silence that followed was pregnant with menace. Marie could almost feel the tension crackling through the mountain air like lightning before a storm. Then Morgan's voice came again, harder now, stripped of any pretense at civility. You're outnumbered 4-1, Hughes. We didn't ride all this way to go home empty-handed. Be smart about this. Send the woman out and we'll leave you be. Keep her and we'll take her anyway, along with whatever else catches our fancy. Marie heard Eric move again, the soft sound of his boots on the wooden floor. When he spoke next, his voice was closer to the door, and there was something in his tone that made her skin prickle with recognition. She had heard that same deadly calm in her father's voice once, when a rattlesnake had gotten into their chicken coop, the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done. You boys made a mistake coming up here, Eric said. Mountains got ways of dealing with mistakes. Sometimes they just disappear, and nobody ever finds so much as a bone. Is that a threat? Morgan's voice had lost some of its confidence. It's a fact. You're in my territory now, Morgan. My rules, my justice. Last chance to ride away while you still can. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Marie pressed her ear to the wall, trying to count the voices, to understand the positions of the men outside. She could hear at least 3 distinct speakers besides Morgan, which meant Eric was indeed outnumbered. But numbers didn't tell the whole story. These were town men, soft from easy living and unused to the harsh realities of mountain survival. Eric Hughes was something else entirely, a predator in his natural element. Burn him out, she heard one of Morgan's men whisper, the words carrying clearly in the thin air. Smoke him out like a badger. And risk burning the woman with him? Morgan hissed back. Use your head, Noah. We need her alive. Noah Allen. Marie recognized the name now. He ran the feed store in Cedar Falls, a weak-chinned man with wandering hands and a reputation for drinking away his profits. What was he doing here, so far from his comfortable life behind a counter? The answer came to her with sickening clarity. Morgan had promised them shares in whatever they recovered, payment in flesh, if not in coin. Could always wait him out, another voice suggested. Man's got to sleep sometime. Winter's coming, Morgan replied. We don't have time for a siege. Besides, Hughes knows these mountains better than we do. Every day we wait gives him more advantages. Marie realized with growing horror that Morgan was right. Eric might be able to hold them off for a while, but eventually exhaustion or simple bad luck would tip the scales. And when that happened, she would face a fate far worse than anything she had imagined during those terrible hours on the auction block. A new sound cut through the night, the distant howl of a wolf echoing off the valley walls. The mournful cry was answered by another, then another, until the darkness seemed alive with wild voices. Marie shivered despite the warmth of the quilts, remembering childhood stories about wolves that hunted in packs, bringing down prey many times their size through coordination and relentless pursuit. Jesus, she heard one of Morgan's men mutter. How many of them are out there? Just wolves, Morgan snapped, but Marie could hear the uncertainty in his voice. They won't come near the fire. But there was no fire outside, she realized. Morgan's men had approached in darkness, relying on stealth rather than warmth. Now they were trapped between the cabin and the wilderness, exposed to whatever predators the night might hold. The irony was not lost on her. They had come here to be predators themselves, only to discover they had entered the territory of something far more dangerous. Hughes, Morgan called out, his voice less steady than before. Let's talk about this reasonable, like maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement. Already told you the arrangement, Eric replied. You leave now while you still can. And if we don't? The silence that followed was more eloquent than any threat. Marie could picture Eric at his window, rifle ready, pale eyes scanning the darkness for movement. He was in his element here, she realized, as comfortable with violence as he was with solitude. The men outside were trespassers in a world they didn't understand, and they were beginning to realize their mistake. Look, Morgan tried again, his tone becoming wheedling. The woman's got value. I'll grant you that. But she's also got debts, legal obligations. Now, I'm willing to be reasonable about this. Split the difference, you might say. You keep her for your needs, and we'll take our payment in other ways. Fair's fair. Marie's stomach turned at the implication. Even now, with death stalking the darkness around them, Morgan was trying to negotiate her body like a commodity. The casual cruelty of it, the assumption that she had no voice in her own fate, filled her with a rage that surprised her with its intensity. No deal, Eric said flatly. Then you're condemning her to worse than what we had in mind, Morgan snarled, his patience finally exhausted. When we're done with you, Hughes, she'll wish she'd come with us willing. Boys, spread out and cover all the windows. We're going in. Marie heard the sound of men moving through the darkness, boots crunching on fallen leaves, the soft scrape of metal against leather as weapons were drawn. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as panic threatened to overwhelm her. This was it, the moment when her fragile hope would be shattered, when the brief illusion of safety would be stripped away like everything else in her life. But then she heard something that made her blood freeze, the soft sound of the cabin door opening. Eric was going outside. Stay in the cabin. His voice drifted up to her, quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. Whatever happens, don't come out until morning. The door closed with a soft click, and Marie was alone with her terror. Through the small window, she could see the faint outline of Eric's figure moving across the porch, rifle in hand, every line of his body speaking of deadly purpose. He was going to face 4 armed men in the darkness, and he was doing it for her. For a woman he barely knew, a piece of property he had bought at auction. There he is, she heard Noah Allen shout. By the porch! The first gunshot shattered the mountain silence like thunder, followed immediately by 2 more. Marie pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle a scream, her eyes straining to see through the darkness. Muzzle flashes lit the night in brief, hellish glimpses, revealing running figures and the stark outline of the cabin against the starlit sky. Eric's rifle spoke once, a deep boom that echoed off the valley walls. Someone screamed, a high, agonized sound that cut off abruptly. Then silence, broken only by the harsh breathing of frightened men and the distant howling of wolves drawn by the scent of blood. Jenkins is down, a voice called out, tight with fear. He's not moving. Keep spread out, Morgan ordered, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. He's just one man. We can take him. But could they? Marie found herself hoping desperately that they could not, that Eric Hughes was everything the stories claimed mountain men to be, a ghost in the wilderness, a predator more dangerous than the wolves that sang in the darkness. Her life, her future, everything depended on his skill and ruthlessness. Another shot rang out, this one from a different position. Eric was moving, she realized, using the darknesses and his knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of his pursuers. The men from town were stumbling around in unfamiliar territory, shooting at shadows while he picked his targets with deadly precision. Where is he? Noah Allen's voice cracked with panic. I can't see him anywhere. Shut up and keep looking, Morgan hissed. He's out there somewhere. A new sound joined the deadly game of cat and mouse, the soft whisper of an arrow cutting through air. Someone gasped, then fell heavily to the ground. Eric had switched weapons, Marie realized, trading the rifle's noise for the bow's stealth. He was hunting them now, and they didn't even know it. This is madness, one of Morgan's men called out. We should leave. Come back with more men, proper equipment. We're not leaving without the woman, Morgan snarled. I've got too much invested in this to walk away empty-handed. But as men were breaking, Marie could hear it in their voices. The confidence that had carried them up the mountain was evaporating like mist before the sun. They had expected to face a lone homesteader, not a phantom who struck from the darkness and vanished like smoke. Eric's rifle spoke again, the sound coming from a completely different direction than before. How was he moving so quietly? How could he see them when they couldn't see him? Marie pressed her face to the window, trying to catch some glimpse of the battle raging below, but the darkness revealed nothing except occasional muzzle flashes and the pale gleam of starlight on metal. Morgan! A voice called out, shaky with fear. Morgan! Where are you? No answer came. Marie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Had Eric taken Morgan? Was their leader already dead or wounded, leaving his men leaderless in hostile territory. The thought filled her with a fierce, savage satisfaction that would have shocked her just days before. The silence stretched on, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of hunting wolves. Marie strained her ears, trying to detect some sign of life from the men below, but the darkness had swallowed them as completely as if they had never existed. Had Eric killed them all? Was it over? Or were they simply waiting, as she was, for someone to make the first move? Then she heard it, so soft she almost missed it. The sound of someone climbing. Not the ladder to the loft, but the outside wall of the cabin. Someone was coming up the back wall, where the logs provided handholds for a determined climber. Her blood turned to ice as she realized the truth. One of Morgan's men had circled around while Eric was dealing with the others, and now he was coming for her directly. Marie looked around the small room desperately, searching for anything that might serve as a weapon. Nancy's sewing basket sat on the shelf, filled with scissors and pins and other harmless domestic tools. But there in the corner where Eric had left them were the extra blankets he had brought up earlier, and beneath them, the glint of metal that made her heart leap with desperate hope. A knife, a simple hunting knife, probably forgotten in the folds of the bedding. Marie grabbed it with shaking hands, surprised by its weight and balance. The blade was sharp enough to shave with, honed to a razor's edge by a man who understood the value of a good tool. It wasn't much against a gun, but it was something. It was hope. The scratching sounds were getting closer now, accompanied by the soft grunt of exertion as someone hauled themselves up the cabin's outer wall. Marie positioned herself beside the window, knife held low and ready, just as her father had taught her years ago when they lived on the frontier and every woman needed to know how to defend herself. The window frame darkened as a shape appeared outside. Marie could make out the silhouette of a man's head and shoulders, could hear his labored breathing as he worked to force the window open. The latch was simple, designed to keep out wind and weather rather than determined intruders. It would not hold for long. Marie's grip tightened on the knife handle as the window began to open. This was it. After everything she had endured, all the humiliation and fear and loss, it would end here in this small room with Nancy's quilts and sewing supplies as witnesses. She thought of Jose, dead in his mineshaft, of the auction block where she had been sold like cattle, of Eric Hughes somewhere in the darkness below, fighting impossible odds to protect a woman he barely knew. She would not go quietly. She would not be taken without a fight. If this was to be her end, she would make it costly for her enemies. The window opened fully, and Noah Allen's pale face appeared in the opening. His eyes were wild with fear and desperation, and there was blood on his shirt front where a bullet or arrow had grazed him. When he saw Marie crouched beside the window, knife in hand, his expression twisted into something ugly and predatory. "There you are, pretty thing," he whispered, his voice thick with malice. "Been looking all over for you. Time to come home and pay your debts." He started to climb through the window, one leg over the sill, then the other. Marie waited until he was halfway through, off balance and vulnerable, before she struck. The knife went in just below his ribs, angled upward toward the heart, just as her father had shown her when butchering hogs. Noah's eyes went wide with shock and pain, and he made a sound like air escaping from a punctured bladder. "You little witch," he gasped, his hands clutching at the knife handle. "You stabbed me. You actually stabbed me." Marie pulled the blade free and stepped back, blood dripping from the steel onto Nancy's braided rug. Noah Allen swayed on his feet, one hand pressed to his side where dark blood was beginning to seep between his fingers. He looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and rage, as if he couldn't comprehend that his victim had dared to fight back. "I'll kill you for that," he snarled, lunging toward her with surprising speed for a wounded man. "I'll make you pay for every drop of blood." But his movements were clumsy, weakened by shock and blood loss. Marie danced aside, the knife weaving between them like a silver serpent. She had found something inside herself that she hadn't known existed, a core of steel that refused to bend or break. This man had come to hurt her, to use her, to reduce her to nothing more than a commodity to be traded and abused. She would die before she let that happen. Noah made another grab for her, and this time Marie's blade found his wrist, opening a gash that sent blood spattering across the small room. He howled in pain and rage, stumbling backward toward the window. For a moment, Marie thought he might retreat, might climb back out into the night and leave her in peace. But then his other hand came up, and she saw the glint of metal in his fist. A pistol, small and nickel-plated, the kind of weapon a store clerk might carry for protection. Noah's face was a mask of blood and fury as he raised the gun toward her, his finger tightening on the trigger. Marie saw death in his eyes and knew that her brief moment of triumph was about to become her final defeat. The shot, when it came, was deafeningly loud in the small room. Marie flinched, expecting to feel the bullet tear through her flesh, expecting the world to dissolve into pain and darkness. Instead, she saw Noah Allen's face explode in a spray of blood and bone fragments. His body toppled backward through the window, crashing to the ground below, with a sound like a sack of grain hitting a barn floor. Eric Hughes stood in the doorway of the small room, his rifle still smoking from the shot that had saved her life. His pale eyes took in the scene with a single glance. The blood on the walls, the knife in Marie's hand, the shattered window where her attacker had fallen. When he looked at her, she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. Marie shook her head, not trusting her voice. The knife fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering on the wooden floor like an accusation. She had killed a man. She had looked Noah Allen in the eyes and driven steel into his body, had watched him die by her own hand. The knowledge should have horrified her, should have sent her into hysterics or shock. Instead, she felt only a cold satisfaction in the strange sense that she had finally found herself. "The others?" she managed to ask. "Dead," Eric said simply. "All of them. Morgan tried to run when he saw how things were going. Did not make it 50 yards before the wolves found him." The wolves, Marie remembered their howling earlier, the way they had seemed to circle the cabin like spectral guardians. Had they been drawn by the scent of blood, or had Eric somehow called them to his aid? In this wild place, far from the laws and customs of civilization, such things seemed possible. "It's over then," she said. Eric nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "For now. But word will get back to Cedar Falls eventually. Morgan had friends, business partners. They'll want to know what happened to him." The implication hit Marie like a physical blow. This wasn't over. It would never be over. As long as she lived, there would be men like Edward Morgan who saw her as property to be claimed, debts to be collected in flesh rather than coin. The brief moment of safety she had found in this mountain valley was already slipping away like water through her fingers. Eric seemed to read her thoughts in her expression. "We'll deal with that when the time comes," he said firmly. "Right now, you need to clean up and get some rest. Tomorrow we'll bury the bodies and figure out what comes next." Marie looked down at herself and was surprised to see how much blood had gotten on her dress. Noah Allen's blood, dark and still warm, staining the fabric like guilt made manifest. She should have been sickened by it, should have been weeping for the man she had killed. Instead, she felt only a grim satisfaction and the knowledge that she would do it again if necessary. "There's a wash basin downstairs," Eric said gently. "Clean water in the bucket by the stove. Take your time." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Marie." "Yes?" "You did well tonight. Nancy would have been proud." The words hit her harder than any blow could have. Nancy Smith, the woman whose memory still haunted this cabin, whose presence lingered in every carefully chosen detail. What would she have thought of the violence that had stained her sewing room, the blood that now marked her quilts and rugs? Would she have understood the necessity of it? Or would she have been horrified by what her sanctuary had become? Marie climbed down the ladder on shaking legs, her body finally beginning to react to the night's events. The cabin felt different now, no longer a shrine to the dead, but a fortress that had been tested in battle and found strong. Eric moved around the main room, checking the windows and doors, securing their defenses against any threat that might still lurk in the darkness. "How did you know?" she asked as she filled the wash basin with water from the bucket. "How did you know he was coming up the back wall?" Eric glanced up from where he was reloading his rifle. "Heard him climbing. Sound carries in the mountains, especially at night. Besides, it's what I would have done in his position." "Of course," Eric Hughes was a hunter, a predator who understood the minds of other predators. He had anticipated Noah Allen's move because it was the logical choice, the desperate gambit of a man who saw his plans falling apart around him. And he had been ready for it, positioned to save her when her own defenses failed. Marie stripped off her blood-stained dress and washed herself with the cold water, scrubbing away the evidence of violence with methodical thoroughness. Her hands were steady now, she noticed with surprise. The trembling that had seized her after the fight was gone, replaced by a calm that felt almost unnatural. She had crossed a line tonight, had done something that could never be undone. But instead of horror, she felt only a strange sense of completion, as if she had finally become the person she was meant to be. When she was clean, she put on one of Nancy's dresses that Eric had left out for her. It was simple blue calico, practical and well-made, and it fit her surprisingly well. Looking at herself in the small mirror by the washstand, Marie saw a stranger staring back. Gone was the broken widow who had stood on the auction block. In her place was a woman with hard eyes and steady hands, someone who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. "Better?" Eric asked when she rejoined him in the main room. "Different," Marie replied honestly. "I feel different." Eric nodded as if he understood. "Killing changes you, has to, or you don't survive it. The trick is not to let it change you too much." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant howling of wolves. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the bodies of 4 men lay cooling in the mountain air, testament to the price of underestimating Eric Hughes and the woman he had chosen to protect. "What happens now?" Marie asked eventually. Eric was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying flames. "Winter's coming," he said finally. "Snow will be here within the month, and it'll stay until spring. Nobody's going to come looking for Morgan and his men until the pass is clear." 6 months of isolation, Marie realized. 6 months trapped in this valley with a man she barely knew, surrounded by the graves of the men she had helped to kill. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt only a strange anticipation. For the first time in her adult life, she would be truly free. No husband to obey, no debts to pay, no society to judge her. Just the mountains and the man who had given her a chance to discover who she really was. "I can work," she said quietly. "I can cook and clean and help with whatever needs doing. I won't be a burden." Eric looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw recognition in his pale eyes. He was seeing the same thing she had seen in the mirror, the transformation from victim to survivor. The broken widow was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "I know," he said simply. The fire crackled and hissed as a log settled in the grate. Outside, the wolves had stopped howling, but Marie could feel their presence in the darkness, patient and watchful. They were part of this place, she realized, as much as the trees and stones and rushing stream. And now, perhaps, she was too. "Eric," she said softly. "Yeah?" "Thank you for everything, for buying me, for bringing me here, for saving my life. I know you didn't have to do any of that." Eric was quiet for so long that Marie thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nancy always said that God puts people in our path for a reason, that we're supposed to help each other, protect each other when we can." I never put much stock in such talk, but maybe she was right. Maybe you being here, maybe all of this, maybe it's supposed to happen this way. Marie felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were something else, something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief, or simply the recognition that she was no longer alone in the world. "She sounds like she was a good woman," Marie said. "She was, the best I ever knew, and she would have liked you, I think. Would have seen the strength in you that I'm just starting to see myself." The compliment warmed Marie more than the fire ever could. To be compared to Nancy Smith, the woman whose memory Eric treasured above all else, was an honor she had never expected to receive. But more than that, it was a sign that she was becoming someone worthy of such comparison, someone strong enough to survive whatever the future might bring. They talked quietly until the fire burned down to coals, sharing stories of their past lives and their hopes for the winter ahead. Eric spoke of his plans for expanding the cabin, of the improvements he wanted to make before the heavy snows came. Marie told him about her childhood on the Kansas prairie, about the skills her mother had taught her, and the dreams she had carried into her marriage with Jose. It felt strange to be planning for the future when the night had brought such violence and death. But perhaps that was what survival meant, Marie thought. Not just living through the immediate crisis, but finding ways to build something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. As the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, Eric stood and stretched, his joints popping from the long day's exertions. "We should get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a hard day." Marie nodded and rose to follow him toward the ladder. But as she reached the bottom rung, Eric's voice stopped her. "Marie?" She turned back to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What you did tonight, fighting back the way you did, it took courage. Real courage. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." The words hit her like a benediction, washing away the last of her doubts and fears. She had found her strength tonight, had discovered that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. And Eric Hughes, the man who had bought her freedom with gold and protected it with blood, had seen that strength and recognized it for what it was. "Good night, Eric," she said softly. "Good night, Marie." She climbed the ladder to the loft, her body aching from the night's exertions, but her spirit soaring with newfound confidence. Behind her, she could hear Eric banking the fire and checking the door one final time. Tomorrow they would bury the dead and begin the work of preparing for winter. But tonight, for the first time in months, Marie Jimenez would sleep without fear. As she settled into the narrow cot in Nancy's sewing room, Marie caught sight of herself in the small mirror on the dresser. The woman looking back at her was no longer the broken widow who had been sold at auction. This was someone new, someone forged in the crucible of violence and emerged stronger for the testing. Someone who could face whatever challenges the future might bring. But even as she closed her eyes and let sleep begin to claim her, Marie couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Edward Morgan had been a small man with small ambitions, but he had mentioned other debts, other creditors who might come looking for what they believed was owed to them. And beyond that loomed the larger question of what would happen when spring came and the outside world intruded once again into their mountain sanctuary. For now, though, those were tomorrow's problems. Tonight she was safe. Tonight she was free. And tonight, for the first time in her adult life, Marie Jimenez was exactly who she chose to be. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window frames and sending pine needles skittering across the cabin roof. In the distance, a wolf howled once, long and mournful, as if mourning the dead or celebrating the living. Marie smiled in the darkness and let the sound carry her toward sleep, toward dreams of snow and solitude, and the strange, fierce man who had given her a chance to discover her own strength. But her dreams, when they came, were not of peace and safety. They were filled with shadows and whispers, with the sound of horses on mountain trails and the glint of gold changing hands in dark places. Somewhere out there, beyond the protective walls of the valley, men were already making plans. Men with longer reach and deeper pockets than Edward Morgan had ever possessed. Men who would not be satisfied with the simple explanation that their associate had met with an unfortunate accident in the wilderness. Winter was coming, but it would not last forever. And when the snows melted and the passes cleared, Marie and Eric would face a reckoning that would make the night's violence seem like a gentle prelude to the storm that was building on the horizon. The first snows came early that year, falling like a benediction over the valley and sealing them away from the world beyond the mountain passes. Marie woke to find the cabin windows frosted with ice crystals that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. Outside, the landscape had been transformed overnight into something pure and untouched. The graves of Morgan's men already disappearing beneath a blanket of white that would hide their secrets until spring. Eric was already up. She could hear him moving around downstairs, the familiar sounds of morning routine that had become as comforting as a lullaby over the past weeks. The steady rhythm of his boots on the wooden floor, the soft clank of the coffee pot against the stove, the whisper of kindling catching fire in the hearth. These small domestic sounds spoke of safety and continuity, of a life being built one ordinary moment at a time. Marie dressed quickly in the cold air, choosing one of Nancy's wool dresses that Eric had altered to fit her properly. His hands, so deadly with rifle and blade, had proven surprisingly gentle with needle and thread, taking in seams and adjusting hems with the patience of a man who understood that survival often depended on attention to the smallest details. She had offered to do the work herself, but he had insisted, claiming it gave him something to do during the long evenings when the wind howled outside and conversation grew scarce. Downstairs, Eric stood at the window watching the snow fall, his coffee cup steaming in his hands. He had shaved off his beard the week before, revealing a face younger and more vulnerable than Marie had expected. The change had startled her at first, this glimpse of the man beneath the mountain man's rough exterior, but she had grown to appreciate the way it made his expressions easier to read. "How deep do you think it'll get?" she asked, joining him at the window. "3 feet by Christmas, maybe 4 by February," Eric replied, his breath fogging the glass. "The passes will be closed until April at the earliest. We're on our own until then." On their own, the words should have carried a note of isolation, of being cut off from civilization and all its comforts. Instead, Marie felt only a deep satisfaction. Let the world beyond the mountains continue its endless cycle of greed and cruelty. Here in this valley, she and Eric had built something different, something clean and honest and worth protecting. The weeks since Morgan's death had passed in a blur of preparation and hard work. They had buried the bodies in a grove of aspen trees on the far side of the valley, marking the graves with simple stone cairns that would weather the seasons without drawing unwanted attention. Eric had burned their belongings, erasing all trace of their presence except for their weapons and horses, which would be useful when spring came and difficult questions needed answering. Together they had reinforced the cabin's defenses, adding shutters to the windows and strengthening the doors with iron bars. They had laid in supplies of food and ammunition, chopped enough firewood to last through the hardest winter, and prepared for the siege of isolation that mountain living demanded. But more than that, they had begun to know each other in the way that only shared hardship could teach. Marie had learned that Eric was a man of few words but deep convictions, someone who measured his actions by an internal compass that never wavered. He had been raised by a circuit preacher, father, and a schoolteacher, mother, had received an education that would have served him well in any eastern city, but had chosen the wilderness because it was the only place where he could be truly himself. The loss of Nancy had nearly broken him, had sent him into a darkness from which he had only recently begun to emerge. Eric, in turn, had discovered that Marie possessed a strength that went far deeper than her ability to defend herself with a knife. She was intelligent and resourceful, quick to learn and quicker to adapt. She could read and write better than most men, could cipher figures and plan ahead with a sort of practical wisdom that made the difference between comfort and mere survival. More than that, she had begun to heal from the wounds that Jose's betrayal and Morgan's cruelty had left on her soul. They worked well together, Marie realized as she watched Eric bank the fire for the day ahead. There was an easy rhythm to their partnership, a natural division of labor that played to each of their strengths. He handled the heavy work, the hunting and woodcutting and maintenance that kept them fed and warm. She managed the domestic sphere, cooking and cleaning and mending with the sort of efficiency that turned a house into a home, but it was more than just practical cooperation. Somewhere in the long evenings of that autumn, as they sat by the fire sharing stories and comfortable silences, something had begun to grow between them. Not love, not yet, but the foundation upon which love might someday be built. Trust, first and foremost, respect, a recognition that they were both damaged people who had found in each other the possibility of healing. "I've been thinking," Eric said, setting down his coffee cup and turning to face her, "about what happens when the snow melts, about the questions that are going to be asked." Marie felt her stomach tighten. She had been dreading this conversation, had hoped that somehow they could avoid it until spring forced their hand. But Eric was right to bring it up now, while they still had time to plan and prepare. "Morgan had partners," she said quietly, "business associates who'll want to know what happened to him. And there were others, men he claimed I owed money to. They'll come looking eventually." Eric nodded grimly. I've been giving that some thought. There's a man I know in Denver, a lawyer named William Hayes. He's helped me with property disputes before, knows how to handle men like Morgan's associates. If we can get word to him, he might be able to make our problems go away legal-like. Legal solutions to illegal problems. It was a thin hope, but better than no hope at all. Marie had learned enough about the world's workings to know that money and influence could accomplish things that justice alone never could. If this William Hayes was as capable as Eric believed, there might be a way out of their predicament that didn't involve more violence and death. What would you tell him? She asked. The truth, mostly. That Morgan tried to collect on fraudulent debts. That he and his men came up here looking for trouble and found more than they bargained for. Self-defense is legal, even in the mountains, especially in the mountains. The plan had merit, Marie had to admit, but it also had risks. Bringing in outside help meant exposing their sanctuary to scrutiny, meant trusting their fate to a man neither of them really knew. And if William Hayes proved less trustworthy than Eric believed, they could find themselves in worse trouble than before. There's another option, Eric continued, his voice carefully neutral. We could leave, pack up what we can carry, and head deeper into the mountains. Find a place where nobody would ever think to look for us. Start over completely. The suggestion hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Marie could picture it clearly, the two of them disappearing into the vast wilderness that stretched beyond the valley, becoming legends whispered around campfires and tavern tables. It would mean giving up everything they had built here, abandoning the cabin and the life they had begun to create. But it would also mean freedom, true and complete, from all the debts and obligations that bound them to their past. Is that what you want? She asked. Eric was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes distant. I don't know, he admitted finally. Part of me thinks it might be the smart thing to do. But another part of me is tired of running, tired of letting other people's greed and cruelty dictate how I live my life. Marie understood the feeling perfectly. She had been running in one way or another since Jose's death, fleeing from creditors and consequences, and the crushing weight of a world that seemed determined to destroy her. The idea of making a stand, of fighting for what they had built instead of abandoning it, held a powerful appeal. The sound of horses in the distance made them both freeze. Eric's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that leaned against the wall, while Marie felt her heart begin to race with familiar fear. But then the wind shifted, and they heard something that made them both relax slightly. A woman's voice, calling out in the universal language of travelers seeking shelter. Hello, the cabin. We're peaceful folks looking for help. Eric moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the shutters. His expression shifted from wariness to surprise, then to something that might have been relief. It's all right, he said, reaching for his coat. I know them. Marie watched from the window as Eric stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. 3 riders emerged from the swirling snow, their horses steaming from the hard climb up the mountain trail. The leader was a woman Marie saw with surprise, tall and straight-backed despite her obvious exhaustion. Behind her rode 2 men, both armed but showing no signs of hostile intent. Ashley Powell, Eric called out, recognition clear in his voice. What brings you up here in weather like this? The woman dismounted with fluid grace, her movements speaking of a lifetime spent in the saddle. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and the sort of weathered beauty that came from a life lived outdoors. Her clothes were practical and well-made, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. Eric Hughes, she replied, her voice carrying a note of genuine warmth. We need to talk about Edward Morgan and the trouble that's coming your way. Marie felt the blood drain from her face. If Ashley Powell knew about Morgan, then their secret was already out. The carefully constructed fiction of an isolated mountain winter was crumbling before it had even properly begun. Eric gestured toward the barn. See to your horses first. We'll talk inside where it's warm. Marie busied herself preparing coffee and food while Eric helped their unexpected guests settle their mounts. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, betraying the fear that she was trying so hard to control. Who was Ashley Powell? How much did she know? And most importantly, what did she want? The three riders entered the cabin, stamping snow from their boots and shaking ice from their coats. Ashley Powell moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in any setting, while her two companions hung back respectfully. They were clearly her employees, Marie realized, not partners or equals. Marie Jimenez, I presume, Ashley said, extending her hand with a smile that seemed genuine. I've heard a great deal about you. Marie took the offered hand cautiously, surprised by the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of hard work. I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've met. No, we haven't, but I knew your husband. Jose Roberts worked for me briefly, about 6 months before his death. Mining operation down near Colorado Springs. The revelation hit Marie like a physical blow. Jose had never mentioned working for a woman, had never spoken of any Ashley Powell. But then Jose had kept many secrets from her, as she had learned to her cost after his death. Please sit, Eric said, gesturing toward the table. You've come a long way in bad weather. There must be something important driving you. Ashley settled into a chair with a grateful sigh, accepting the cup of coffee that Marie offered with obvious appreciation. Her two companions remained standing, their eyes constantly scanning the room in the manner of professional guards. There is indeed, Ashley said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Edward Morgan is dead, along with 3 of his men. The official story is that they got lost in an early blizzard and froze to death. But we both know that's not what really happened. Eric's expression remained carefully neutral. Do we? Ashley smiled, but there was no humor in it. Eric, I've known you for 10 years. I know what you're capable of when pushed. Morgan came up here looking for trouble, and he found it. The question is, what do we do about it now? The directness of the approach caught Marie off guard. She had expected denials and careful probing, not this frank acknowledgement of the truth, but perhaps that was Ashley Powell's way to cut through pretense and get straight to the heart of matters. Depends on what you want, Eric replied, his tone matching hers for directness. I want to help you, Ashley said simply. Morgan was a problem for a lot of people, not just you and Marie. He had his fingers in half a dozen crooked schemes, was bleeding money from businesses all over the territory. His death actually solves more problems than it creates. Marie found her voice at last. Then why are you here? Ashley turned to look at her directly, and Marie saw something unexpected in her eyes. Sympathy, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. Because Morgan had partners, and they're not going to let this go. They'll want answers, and they'll want revenge. More importantly, they'll want to recover the money they think you owe them. I don't owe them anything, Marie said hotly. Those debts died with Jose. You and I know that, Ashley replied gently. But the law is a flexible thing when there's enough money involved. They'll find ways to make their claims stick, at least long enough to cause you serious trouble. Eric leaned forward in his chair. What kind of trouble? The kind that involves federal marshals and extradition orders. The kind that could see Marie dragged back to Denver in chains to face charges of theft and fraud. They've got enough influence to make it happen, Eric. Don't underestimate them. The words sent ice through Marie's veins. She had thought that Morgan's death had ended her troubles, but it seemed that it had only marked the beginning of something far worse. Federal marshals were not mountain thugs who could be frightened off with rifle fire and wolfie howls. They represented the full weight of government authority, and they would not be deterred by winter weather or difficult terrain. So what do you suggest? Eric asked. Ashley reached into her coat and pulled out a leather portfolio, spreading its contents on the table. Legal documents Marie saw covered with official seals and signatures. Her heart sank as she recognized the format, remembering similar papers from the auction that had destroyed her life. Jose Roberts signed these before his death, Ashley said, her finger tracing across the top document. A contract making him a full partner in my mining operation, with all debts and obligations transferred to my company upon his demise. It's completely legal and properly witnessed. Marie stared at the papers in confusion. But Jose never mentioned any partnership. He said he was just working day wages for you. Because I asked him to keep it quiet. There are people in this territory who don't like the idea of a woman running a major mining operation. It was easier for everyone if Jose appeared to be just another hired hand. The explanation made sense, Marie realized with growing hope. Jose had always been secretive about his work, claiming that mine owners were paranoid about claim jumpers and industrial spies. If he had been sworn to secrecy about his true relationship with Ashley Powell, it would explain his silence. What does this mean for Marie? Eric asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. It means that any debts Jose incurred became the responsibility of Powell Mining Company, not his widow. It means that Marie Jimenez is free and clear of any legal obligations. And it means that Morgan's partners can go whistle for their money because they'll have to take it up with me and my lawyers. The relief that flooded through Marie was so intense it made her dizzy. Freedom, real freedom, backed by legal documents and corporate protection. It seemed too good to be true, too perfect a solution to problems that had seemed insurmountable. Why, she managed to ask, why would you do this for me? Ashley's expression softened slightly. Because Jose was a good man who got in over his head with the wrong people. Because you've suffered enough for his mistakes. And because I believe in taking care of my own. Her own. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Ashley Powell was offering more than just legal protection, Marie realized. She was offering belonging, a place in the world where Marie's past wouldn't matter and her future could be whatever she chose to make it. There's more, Ashley continued. I'm expanding my operations, looking for people I can trust to help run things. Jose spoke highly of your intelligence and your business sense. If you're interested, there's a position waiting for you. Good wages, respectable work, and all the protection my company can provide. A job, a real job, with wages and respect and the chance to build a life based on her own merits rather than her husband's debts. Marie felt tears prick at her eyes as the magnitude of the offer sank in. This was what she had dreamed of during those dark days after Jose's death, the chance to stand on her own feet and make her own way in the world. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, Marie found herself looking at Eric. What would this mean for him? For the fragile partnership they had built over the autumn months? Would he want to come with her? To leave his mountain sanctuary for the uncertain world of business and civilization? Or would this be where their paths diverged, where the bond forged in blood and isolation finally snapped under the weight of practical necessity? Eric seemed to read her thoughts in her expression. It's a good offer, he said quietly. Better than anything you could have hoped for a few months ago. There was something in his tone that made Marie's heart clench with sudden understanding. He was letting her go, giving her permission to choose the safe path even if it meant leaving him behind. The generosity of the gesture, the selfless love it represented, nearly broke her composure entirely. What about you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes distant. I've got the cabin, the valley. Everything I need is right here. But that wasn't true, Marie realized with sudden clarity. Everything he needed wasn't here anymore, because she had become part of what he needed, just as he had become essential to her own sense of completeness. The thought of leaving him, of returning to the world beyond the mountains without the man who had saved her life and shown her how to save herself, was unbearable. Ashley Powell watched this silent exchange with the shrewd eyes of someone who understood human nature in all its complexity. The offer extends to both of you, she said quietly. I could use a man with Eric's skills, and I suspect you two work well together. The words hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to drowning swimmers. Marie felt her heart leap with sudden hope, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was Eric's decision to make, not hers. She had no right to pressure him into abandoning the life he had built in these mountains. What kind of work? Eric asked, his tone carefully neutral. Security, mostly, protection for my operations and the people who work for them. There are still plenty of men like Morgan out there, and they don't all die as conveniently as he did. I need people I can trust to handle situations that the law can't or won't address. It was a polite way of saying that Ashley Powell needed a killer, Marie realized, someone willing to use violence when necessary to protect what was hers. The work would be dangerous, but it would also be purposeful, a chance for Eric to use his skills in service of something larger than mere survival. The pay is excellent, Ashley continued, and there would be opportunities for advancement for both of you. I'm not just talking about homes, I'm talking about careers, about building something that will last. Eric stood and walked to the window, staring out at the falling snow. Marie could see the tension in his shoulders, the internal struggle between the safety of isolation and the risks of engagement with the wider world. She wanted to speak, to tell him what she hoped he would choose, but she forced herself to remain silent. This had to be his decision, made freely and without coercion. When would you need an answer? Eric asked finally. Spring, Ashley replied, when the pass is clear and travel becomes possible again. That gives you both time to think it over, to decide what you really want. Time to think, time to let their relationship develop naturally without the pressure of immediate decision. Marie felt a flutter of gratitude toward this strange woman who seemed to understand so much about the delicate balance of human emotions. The rest of the day passed in careful conversation as Ashley and her companions shared news from the outside world, and Eric and Marie learned about the empire that Ashley Powell had built through determination and shrewd business sense. She owned 3 mining operations, 2 freight companies, and a small army of employees who were fiercely loyal to her vision of honest enterprise in a dishonest world. As evening fell and the snow continued to accumulate outside, Ashley's men bedded down in the barn while she accepted Eric's offer of the main room floor. Marie retreated to her small chamber in the loft, but sleep proved elusive. Too much had changed in a single day. Too many possibilities had opened up to allow for easy rest. She could hear Ashley and Eric talking quietly by the fire, their voices too low to make out individual words but carrying the cadence of serious discussion. Were they talking about the job offer? About Marie herself? About the future that stretched ahead of them like an uncharted territory full of promise and peril? When Marie finally did sleep, her dreams were filled with images of a different life. She saw herself in a real office, wearing fine clothes and making decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of people. She saw Eric at her side, still dangerous but channeling that danger in the service of justice rather than mere survival. She saw a future where their past didn't define them, where they could be whoever they chose to become. But even in her dreams, Marie couldn't quite shake the feeling that such happiness was too good to last. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her sleeping mind, she sensed shadows gathering, threats that would test everything they had built together. Ashley Powell's offer was generous, but generosity always came with a price. The question was whether they would be willing to pay it when the time came. Morning brought clear skies and the sort of crystalline cold that made every breath visible as vapor. Ashley and her men prepared to leave early, eager to reach lower elevations before the next storm system moved through. But before they departed, Ashley pulled Marie aside for a private conversation. I meant what I said yesterday, she began, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, about taking care of my own. But I want you to understand what you'd be getting into if you accept my offer. Marie waited, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. My business interests put me in conflict with some very powerful people, Ashley continued. Men who don't like competition, especially from a woman. Working for me means making enemies, dangerous ones. It means always looking over your shoulder, always being ready for trouble. The warning was soberly given and seriously meant. Marie appreciated the honesty, the refusal to sugarcoat the realities of the choice she faced. But she had already lived through the worst that powerful men could inflict, had already faced death and emerged stronger for the experience. I'm not afraid, she said simply. Ashley smiled, and for the first time, Marie saw genuine warmth in her eyes. No, I don't suppose you are. Jose always said you had steel in your spine. I'm beginning to think he underestimated just how much. They watched as Ashley's party rode away into the morning light, their horses' hooves crunching through the fresh snow. Soon they were just dark specks against the white landscape. Then nothing at all. Marie and Eric stood on the porch until the last echo of hoofbeats had faded, then went back inside to contemplate the choices that lay ahead of them. What do you think? Marie asked as they settled by the fire with fresh cups of coffee. Eric was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames as if they might reveal the secrets of the future. I think Ashley Powell is exactly what she appears to be, he said finally. Honest, capable, and dangerous to cross. Working for her would be risky, but it would also be worthwhile. And leaving here, giving up your sanctuary? Eric looked around the cabin, taking in all the memories it held. Nancy's touches were still everywhere, but they no longer seemed like shrines to the past. Instead, they felt like blessings on whatever future might come. This place served its purpose, he said quietly. It kept me alive when I wanted to die, gave me time to heal from Nancy's loss. But maybe it's time to stop hiding from the world and start engaging with it again. Marie felt her heart swell with love for this complex, wounded man who had saved her life and taught her how to save herself. The offer from Ashley Powell represented everything she had dreamed of, but it would mean nothing if she had to face it alone. Together? She asked. Eric turned to look at her directly, and in his pale eyes she saw the answer she had been hoping for. Together. The winter that followed was the happiest time of Marie's life. Isolated from the world by walls of snow and ice, she and Eric settled into a rhythm of domestic contentment that felt as natural as breathing. They worked side by side on projects to improve the cabin, read aloud to each other from Eric's collection of books, and talked long into the night about their hopes and dreams for the future. It was during those long conversations that Marie began to understand the depth of Eric's character, the complex mixture of gentleness and steel that made him who he was. He told her about his childhood as a preacher's son, about the crisis of faith that had driven him into the wilderness, and about the slow process of finding his own moral code in a world that often seemed devoid of justice. Marie, in turn, shared stories of her own past, the dreams she had carried into her marriage with Jose, and the bitter lessons she had learned about the difference between love and possession. She spoke of her parents, dead now for many years, and the values they had instilled in her about the importance of standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. As the weeks passed, the careful distance they had maintained began to dissolve. Small gestures of affection became natural, unconscious. A touch of hands while passing dishes at dinner. Eric's arm around her shoulders as they sat by the fire. The comfortable intimacy of shared domestic space and mutual trust. It was Marie who finally broke the unspoken barrier between them, on a night when the wind howled outside and the cabin felt like the only warm spot in a frozen world. She climbed down from the loft and found Eric sitting by the dying fire, staring into the coals with the sort of expression that spoke of old pain revisited. "Thinking about Nancy?" she asked softly. Eric nodded without looking up, wondering what she would think of all this. "Of you. Of the choices I've made." Marie settled beside him on the rough wooden bench, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, but not quite touching. "What do you think she would say?" Eric was quiet for a long moment. "I think she would tell me to stop living in the past and start building a future. She always said that love wasn't meant to be hoarded like gold, that it was meant to be shared and renewed." The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Marie felt her heart racing as she realized that this was the moment she had been both hoping for and dreading. The moment when they would either move forward together or remain forever trapped in the careful distance of friendship. "Eric," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the eaves. He turned to look at her then, and in his pale eyes she saw everything she needed to know. Love, yes, but also uncertainty. Fear of betraying Nancy's memory, worry about what the future might hold. All the complex emotions of a man trying to balance loyalty to the dead with responsibility to the living. Marie reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life in the mountains. "She's gone," she said gently, "and we're here, and I think that matters." Eric's fingers tightened around hers, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not the abandonment of his love for Nancy, but the acceptance that love could grow and change and encompass more than one person across the span of a lifetime. When he kissed her, it was with the tenderness of a man who understood the precious fragility of human connection. Marie felt tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't have said whether they were tears of joy or sorrow or simple relief. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it, the completion that came from finding someone who understood both her strength and her vulnerability. They made love that night with the gentle passion of two people who had found in each other something worth cherishing. It was nothing like the rough urgency that had characterized her marriage to Jose, Nothing like the brutal taking that men like Morgan represented. Instead, it was a celebration of mutual respect and growing affection, a physical expression of the emotional bond that had been building between them through the long months of shared hardship. Afterward, as they lay entwined before the dying fire, Marie felt a peace she had never known before. Mbwa- This was what love was supposed to be, she realized. Not the desperate clinging of the desperate, but the calm certainty of two people who chose each other freely and completely. I love you, Eric said quietly, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. I love you too, Marie replied, and knew that she meant it with every fiber of her being. The rest of the winter passed in a blur of quiet happiness. They were lovers now, but also partners in every sense of the word, working together toward the future they would build when spring finally came. Eric began teaching Marie to shoot, recognizing that the world they were entering would require her to be able to defend herself. Marie, in turn, helped Eric plan for the transition from mountain hermit to working man, discussing the challenges and opportunities that Ashley Powell's offer represented. As the snows began to melt and the first green shoots of spring appeared in the valley, they made their final preparations for departure. The cabin would remain, Eric decided, as a refuge they could return to if the outside world proved too hostile or demanding. But their real life now lay beyond the mountains, in the complex and dangerous world of Ashley Powell's business empire. On the morning they were to leave, Marie stood on the porch one last time, looking out over the valley that had been her sanctuary and her school. So much had changed since that terrible day when Edward Morgan's hammer had fallen and sealed her fate. The broken widow who had been sold at auction was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and was prepared to fight for it. Eric emerged from the cabin carrying the last of their supplies, his face reflecting the same mixture of anticipation and regret that Marie felt. This place had saved them both, had given them time to heal and grow, and discover what they meant to each other. Leaving it felt like closing a chapter in the story of their lives. Ready? He asked, securing the pack behind his saddle. Marie took one last look around the valley, memorizing every detail for the uncertain days ahead. Then she mounted the horse that Eric had bought for her in the settlement below, a gentle mare with intelligent eyes and a steady temperament. Ready, she said. They rode out of the valley as the morning sun painted the peaks gold and crimson, their horses' hooves ringing on stone still slick with melting snow. Behind them the cabin stood empty, but not abandoned, waiting for their return. Ahead of them lay the world with all its promises and perils, all its opportunities for triumph and disaster. But they rode toward it together, and that made all the difference. Marie Jimenez had been sold at auction like a piece of property, had endured humiliation and violence and the crushing weight of other people's expectations. But she had survived it all, had found in herself reserves of strength and courage she had never known she possessed. More than that, she had found love. Not the desperate attachment of the needy, but the calm certainty of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of the costs and benefits involved. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as partners, as equals, as two people who had learned that the most valuable things in life could not be bought or sold, but only freely given. The mountain man had outbid them all, but in the end, he had given her something far more precious than the money he had paid. He had given her back herself, and in return, she had given him a reason to rejoin the world of the living. It was, Marie thought, as they rode toward their uncertain but hopeful future, a fair exchange. As they crested the ridge that marked the boundary of the valley, Marie turned for one last look at the place that had changed everything. The cabin was just a speck now, dwarfed by the immensity of the mountains that surrounded it. But it would always be there, she knew, a reminder of the winter when two broken people had found in each other the strength to become whole. Then they were over the ridge and riding down toward the world below, toward Ashley Powell and her empire, toward whatever adventures and challenges awaited them. Marie felt no fear, only excitement in the calm confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The auction block was behind her now, along with all the shame and helplessness it represented. Ahead lay a future limited only by her own courage and determination. She was Marie Jimenez, and she was coming home to herself at last.